So I don't think it's a secret that price is one of the most deciding factors for success when selling on Amazon. It's also not a big secret that sellers coming from China tend to have some of the most aggressive and competitive pricing on the platform. As a result, some of the biggest, most successful, most formidable competition on the Amazon platform comes from the East. Now, this video is not your typical bang on Chinese sellers video that others have put out in space. This is about reverse engineering their success, understanding how they're so dang good at selling on Amazon, and how you can take these learnings to become a more successful e-commerce seller yourself. Let's go. As usual, what is up, guys? Welcome to the Heist YouTube community, where every single Monday on a weekly basis, we try to drop as much value as humanly possible to make you a better e-commerce and Amazon FBA seller. So I think it goes without saying that one of the most controversial topics that I certainly tend to see in various Facebook groups and Amazon selling communities is the topic of Chinese sellers. More specifically, those that are on the Amazon FBA platform that tend to hail from China, either as factories or as individual sellers that are competing on the platform. And there tends to be a lot of frustration because frankly, they're really successful. And I think if we're honest, envy sometimes breeds contempt, but they have advantages and low prices that are very difficult for your traditional Western seller to compete with. And then I think that there's some sentiment, some incorrect, some correct, that they don't always play by the rules, hence making uncompetitive and difficult to compete. Whatever your stance is on these issues, I'm not here to call out who's running red lights and who's doing things the right way, the wrong way, the incorrect way, the correct way. That's not what this is about. This is about really understanding highly successful people on the platform, understanding the mechanics for how and why they're successful, diagnosing those elements so that you can understand what you're up against, you can determine where you find success, and you yourself can be a more formidable competitor on the platform. And I think the reality is, if you're getting your butt kicked by a certain competition, wouldn't it be better to at least understand why and how? I would certainly want to know. And I would also say that these previous historic sentiments about Chinese sellers being nefarious and using black hat tactics, while that obviously exists, and I'm not trying to say that it doesn't, but it exists across lots of different seller types. And I think the massive suspensions that have taken place due to review manipulation and other things that have taken place over the last year, I think what is left is by and large really successful competitors that we can learn something from. So if you're here to respect and learn the game, to understand the competition, and to think better about how to compete, this video is for you. So let's get after it. So to get into understanding the success of Chinese sellers, it's first really important to revisit the Amazon flywheel. Now, this flywheel is really designed to better understand the actual Amazon company business model and why they've been so successful and why they've absorbed such a massive amount of retail commerce globally, and certainly for e-commerce. And by better understanding what makes Amazon successful, it also helps us as sellers to diagnose and reverse engineer what individual products and or brands on the platform make them successful. So Amazon is all about having the most products in the world at the lowest possible price with the best customer satisfaction. That's the trifecta. And the elements that feed this trifecta and make it such an insurmountable engine of e-commerce is the fact that they take a lot of the operational complexity and costs out of the equation for those that are selling on the platform. So there's actually a lower cost structure. That lower cost structure makes it such that the products that are served up on the platform tend to have really aggressive lower prices, especially when you compare them against larger brands and or brick and mortar retail, which has a middleman markup. Because of this wide selection, because of low prices, the customer selection is really broad and wide, so customers like it. That leads to more traffic, more Prime users. That leads to more sales. Because the sales increase, it attracts more sellers to the platform, which provides more choice, which provides lower costs, which provides lower prices, and the flywheel continues. And this really explains the domination of Amazon over the past decade. And there's really a similar flywheel for the products and or brands that are successful on the platform, meaning that the more sales that a brand gets, the more reviews that they get. When they have more sales and reviews, they get lower ad costs, they get more traffic, they get more profit, that reduces their cost structure. And then there's an individual flywheel that makes products that can really get that sales velocity going much more successful. And I think understanding both what makes Amazon successful and what makes individual products successful can help you understand who is succeeding on the platform. And because of that sales velocity and price advantage that Chinese sellers tend to bring to the table. This has been a critical reason why in many categories, especially competitive categories, they've eaten the lunch of the competition. So understanding the flywheel and those dynamics is important. Now, the second element to understanding Chinese sellers is what are their distinct advantages that those outside of China simply do not have access to or that they can't easily replicate. First, the actual seller may be the factory themselves. So oftentimes many of these Chinese sellers are the factory. So they're not doing markup on the actual factory costs. They're taking all the pure retail margins. So there's no markup from the factory. That could be one thing. And if they're not the factory, the likelihood that they actually have a relationship, have conversations, and are able to get a better deal structure done with the actual factory goes up substantially. Much like if you were negotiating milk from your farmer down the street, you could probably get a better price on that milk and eggs than somebody from Shenzhen could. So I think that proximity and that cultural access gives them either a lower price from the factory or they're the factory themselves. The second is shipping costs. There tends to be a lot of fragmentation in the freight market with a ton of Chinese exporters and freight forwarders. Again, because of the language and cultural connection that's done there, there's a much better chance that a seller from China using a Chinese freight forwarder is going to have a lower per unit cost than somebody from a Western market using a more traditional freight forwarder would. Thirdly, there's government incentives such that the tax rate of the actual companies may be either nothing or significantly lower than European and or North American sellers. But there's also tons of incentives for trade and export within many Chinese cities and regions. In fact, there's some trade zones within China where they heavily incentivize people to grow industry there. So depending on the industry, the city, and what's actually being exported, Chinese sellers tend to have a massive tax advantage that Western sellers typically wouldn't have. And on a related note, again, I don't want to call out who's running red lights, who's not, but it's pretty common knowledge that the vast majority of Chinese sellers will actually underwrite their invoice value when they're importing goods into the United States or into European countries such that the tariff rate is lower on a per order basis, which can add up especially for high tariff products. The next piece is they're frankly just willing to absorb a lower margin. Pretty commonplace for Western sellers to be in a 30 to 50% plus margin range. Chinese sellers are frankly comfortable making much less unit margin to sacrifice for sales velocity, reviews, and a gross cumulative profit. So they're much more focused on cumulative profit than they are incremental margin, and they're frankly willing to go into deeper margin waters than many Western sellers are for a number of different reasons. And because of all these things, they tend to have a lower price, which means that they get a higher sales velocity, higher review velocity, better conversion rates, better click share from organic results, a much larger percentage of organic sales versus pay-per-click sales, and lower ad costs. And because they're able to turn product over so much faster, and because oftentimes they're either the factory and or they're working with the factory, they have additional incentives for when they actually have to pay for product, they tend to have a much better working capital position. So their cash in, cash out cycles, in other words, the amount of time they need to wait for actual revenue to come in from when they've actually paid for product is much shorter. And because these working capital requirements are much shorter, they can turn cash over. So that cash flow engine is a lot faster than you would typically see from a higher margin, slower sales velocity seller that comes from the West. And then the final advantage I would say that Chinese sellers tend to hold, and I can tell you from experience, they have a team of people incrementally focused on every detail that matters. So you literally may have one person where all their job is to focus on reviews for a single ASIN. There might be another employee that is literally focused only on creating and developing and launching products. And there's numerous examples across multiple functions, but I think the point is they've got a much more spread out labor focus for each of the elements of the Amazon business. And I think that focus tends to breed increased performance across all of those metrics where they have employees dedicated to. So that's a summary. Let's actually dive into my computer. We'll find an example. We'll look at the dynamics as it plays out on the first page. I'll show you how to find out whether the sellers are from China or not. And then we'll actually crunch some numbers and we'll see what the math looks like and what you can learn from it and how it may inform your strategy as a seller. All right, so to track down a good example, let's just come in here to the brand analytics section within Amazon Seller Central. And let's just find one of the most searched categories on Amazon. And what this is basically showing is the most searched terms within the Amazon platform. So let's just kind of scroll down and see if there's an interesting one that might be worth checking out. So this is the 16th most searched keyword on the Amazon platform. So this should give us a pretty good idea in finding some Chinese sellers that have really been dominating this category. Alrighty, so this is the search results for shower curtain. Yin. So these are all sponsored, so we don't necessarily care about them per se, but that's the start of the organic results. So it looks like the average price here is about $19. The average revenue per month on the front page is 144 grand, and this total market size on a monthly basis is coming up on $7 million. So if we just kind of go through here, we've got one that's the top dog's doing 530 grand roughly a month. The next, and that's priced at $21.99. The next one down is $16.99. They're doing $3.95. And then this big dog right here in terms of revenue, 634, is priced at $10.88. So let's just have a look at this particular ASIN just so we can get a better understanding of what we're dealing with here. So pretty simple, obviously really aggressive pricing here. Looks like just a basic white curtain, nothing fancy with the images here. You wouldn't be getting any creative awards, and it's sold by Akaka. And we can see through the address that this is an actual Chinese seller, unsurprising at that price point and at that sales velocity, which is super high. You can see that they sell 58,000 units a month, which is pretty insane. Let's look at one that's also aggressively priced, but not quite as low. So this one here is $16.99. These guys are doing close to 400,000. And if we come down here, what a name, Amazur Bath. Potentially some trademark issues there with Amazon, but let's not cast judgment. And yeah, these guys are from Shenzhen as well, so we can see that they're also Chinese sellers. So two of the more price competitive players on that front page of results hail from China. All right, now scrolling down here, I'm looking to find like a more traditional, what I would say like a Western private labeler. So you can just kind of tell by the brand name, this Holland Perry, likely Western seller. They're also selling for about 26 bucks. And then their revenue, nothing to scoff at, is 55,000 per month. So let's go ahead and click on these guys. And same deal, that's sold by Shop Daily Essentials. Let's come down to that and look at this, Sandy, Utah. So that's actually like 30 minutes from where I live. So this is what you'd expect from a typical Western seller, right? So the price obviously can't be nearly as competitive, and it's really playing on aesthetic design here. The photography is a lot nicer. You can just see it's a little bit more well put together. But if we come and look at them, they're doing 2,000 units a month versus like the 54,000 a month. So this is pretty common for most relatively competitive categories on Amazon, where you're going to see a lot of the top dogs be price competitive, most of them from China. And then it's really just your Western sellers that are further down the map doing much less sales velocity, still decent monthly revenue, but due to the price point, they've just got a bit of a gap in terms of what people are seeking out. All right, so let's actually break this down so you can see the important stuff, which is really the math. And I think this might actually surprise a lot of people. So we're really going to go from top to bottom, looking at the actual Amazon price, all the way down through Amazon fees, the factory costs, duty rates, advertising spend, returns, net profit, ROI. Then we're going to look at the actual sales per month, revenue per month, and then the cumulative profit per month. And then we'll dig into the actual working capital, inventory cycles, and cash flow, just so you can understand through these scenarios. So these first three are actually going to be from the homepage of search results for that shower curtain. So we had Amazur Bath, we had Akaka, and then we had the private labeler from Utah. And then I'm going to actually do a hypothetical kind of branded USA seller that may be a brick and mortar omni-channel seller. So let's first look at the Amazon price. So $16.99 for the slightly higher quality one. The just down the middle price competitive crappy shower curtain, $10.88. The Western private label seller was $25.95. And then let's say that you had a brand that was like in Target or something, maybe like a Chip and Joanna Gaines Magnolia curtain. I'm making that up, but let's say that one's 35 bucks. The referral fee is just 15% times revenue. So obviously the lower the price, the lower the referral fee. I'm assuming the same size for the FBA fee across the board at $5.79. That might change a little bit. Now here's where it starts to get interesting, right? So this is the more premium kind of wave curtain, which is likely going to cost more. So I'm just assuming a factory cogs here of $350. This cheapo kind of white plasticky one probably actually the factory selling it. So we're going to assume $1.80 there. And then because this private label Western seller had those like tassels, it looked like more of a canvas style. Obviously the higher quality is going to breed a little bit more expense. And then for the branded US sellers, it's probably going to be a similar cost here to this guy, maybe a little bit more for packaging, but the price is likely higher if they're selling in retail and or they've got more branded search. If we come down to duty, this is one of those interesting things. I've actually assumed that the duty rate is half of 10% here, simply because they may be and likely are underwriting the invoice. So these guys are paying 18 cents a unit. These guys are paying 9 cents a unit tariff. And you'll start to see a pretty big disadvantage here against these Western players, which are 4 to 5x plus the duty rate cost here, just because we're assuming that these guys are playing by the rules and not changing their invoice value. Tacos here as well, I'm just assuming kind of standard aggressive price, but not crazy price. I actually saw these guys on the sponsored search results. We know that they're spending money on ads, so I'm assuming a 12% tacos here. For these guys though, because they're so low priced, they can't really afford ads and or don't focus on ads. They're really focused on sales velocity based on price. So I've only assumed a 5% tacos here. And then your Western seller, I'm assuming the latest kind of Amazon range, which is probably 15 to 20% tacos for a lot of people now. So I've assumed 18%. And then the branded seller here, I'm assuming 10% because they're probably not spending as much on ads. They're probably relying more on branded search, which tends to be cheaper. Returns, I've just assumed the same all the way across the board of 4%. So we've got the net profit dollar amount, and then we've got the actual net profit range. So we can see here, these guys are barely above 5%, which is like thin air. A lot of people couldn't survive on 5% margins. These next more middle of the road, but still aggressive Chinese sellers are still lower than average, I would say, with a net profit of 13%. But here's the surprising thing that I don't think a lot of people think through. This, down the middle private label Western seller comes in at 17%. So despite the fact that they're priced in this case 2.5 times, and in this case like $9 higher, they're actually getting not a whole lot higher of a unit margin. And that's because they've got higher factory costs. They're paying straight up duties. Their advertising cost is a big one. They're spending a lot more on ads. And so all those things erode their profit margin. So even if their gross profit's higher, their net margin comes in at 17%. And again, the branded US player is sitting in a bit better of a position simply because they've got the higher price there. So if we look at the actual ROI, which is a really critical metric in physical products for turning your cash over quickly, we can see here that these guys still haven't broken 100%. You want to hit at least 100% in many cases to be able to turn your cash over. These guys obviously are sitting pretty because they've got their healthy retail margins. And then these guys are really low. So you're thinking, well, crap, how could these guys make money if they're only doing 5% net margin and their ROI is 30%? Like there's no way that they're turning cash over. What a tough business to be in. But things get interesting. So let's look at the sales per month. Again, these guys are doing 58,000 sales. Insane. Not too shabby, but about half of that just again because of the price. Here, these guys are doing 23,000. And then we have our middle America seller doing just a little bit north of 2,000. Again, in our hypothetical, we're just assuming some branded searches bringing in more sales for these guys. So the revenue per month kind of correlates similarly. And then here's what's crazy interesting. If you actually multiply this net profit number here per unit by the actual sales per month, we'll get the cumulative monthly profit. So these guys here are basically the biggest revenue guys, but they're obviously taking a lot less profit in, but they're still doing 34,000, 3x plus what your American seller is doing in profit. So even though that they're making way less money on a percentage basis and their ROI is pretty crappy, they're making pretty good coin. And then these guys here, the more premium but still aggressive Chinese sellers, are making close to the most bank. And then here again, our branded players that have the luxury of actually getting branded search, maybe they're in Target, maybe they got a brand name like Magnolia, Chip and Joanna Gaines. They're just making bank simply because of brand recognition. If we come down here just to look at the cycle turns, to sell 10,000 units basically takes these guys 13 days, takes these guys only 5, takes these guys almost 6 months to turn 10,000 units, and these guys it takes about 2 months. So here's what's really interesting. If we kind of look at how important reviews are, because of that sales rate, these guys are making pretty good profit, more than these guys, but they're getting 5,500 reviews. Look at these guys. At this review rate of 2% per sales, they're doing 14,000 reviews a year. And this is where this insurmountable advantage comes from. Despite making less profits, they're turning over so much volume. Even if they're making a little bit less gross monthly profit, their reviews are insane. So this review rate, in addition to that price, makes for an incredibly high conversion rate and sales velocity versus your American sellers only getting about 500 reviews a year. So it's going to take them a couple years just to get into triple digits for review rates. So I hope that's given you a new perspective on some things that you may not have thought about when reverse engineering and thinking about the success of Eastern sellers. But what's the so what? What can you do about this? Well, one big lesson for me as I've started to analyze this competitive dynamic here over the last couple months is it might make sense to at least flirt with lowering your price. For a very long time, I've kind of been the opposite of that, and you might have seen some of that on this channel. And I definitely think that playing a premium and having an advantage other than price is absolutely critical, so it's not a race to the bottom. But price matters a lot, especially when you consider all the options that exist on the first page. And because the organic slots that are visible for most sellers as they scroll have gone down due to increased ad placements, it really is important to get as much organic placement as you can. And one of the ways that you can do that is at least being in a reasonable range within those prices. So as an example, if I was a Western seller in that scenario, I might actually look at going down to like $19.99 for a little bit and just saying, hey, do I actually sell like 7,000 units a month versus 2,000 if I go down to $19.99? Maybe my ROI is like 50, 60%, but if I can get working capital right, get those cash turns over, I might actually make way more cash in the bank that will help me grow and scale my business. So look at those cash cycles and the impact that price has on them. The second is, what can you do in terms of product development that gets you as close to the actual factory cogs of a Chinese competitor as possible? This one's a little bit trickier of a nut to crack, but what kind of innovation, what kind of sourcing, what kind of product development can you do that brings back some of those factory cost advantages to your core that will give you that additional margin, but more importantly, let you play much more aggressively with your pricing, get a little bit closer, in addition to just having better photography, better differentiation, and a better product. And then finally, in that branded example, this just highlights how important it is to get branded search, to get an audience, to get omni-channel traffic outside of Amazon coming to your listing to purchase and seek out your product. When you're able to do this, it becomes much less competitive to compete against Chinese sellers and to get those marquee organic placements, because you can still make, as we saw in that example, like 68,000 net profit on a product. So instead of kicking dirt, instead of using Chinese sellers as a scapegoat, I recommend looking at the dynamics at play in your market, sharpen your sword, figure out how you can be better understanding these dynamics so that you can better compete. And until next week, check out this video, which I did recently, that actually breaks down these two approaches and strategies in a little bit more detail, how you can play the value game and how you can actually play the premium game. But I hope this one was valuable, guys. Cheers.